On a warm summer morning, August 4th, 1992, the city of Toledo, Ohio, was just beginning to wake up. But in a quiet park on the city's east side, a horrifying discovery would set off a chain of events that would ruin lives, destroy trust, and expose deep cracks in America's justice system. What began as an ordinary day would spiral into a 3-decade nightmare for one teenage boy, a boy who would lose everything because of a story that wasn't true. At about 7:30 a.m., a man and his wife were walking their dog through Woodrow Wilson Park, a peaceful patch of green where families played and kids rode their bikes. But on this morning, something was terribly wrong. Lying in the damp grass, just off a walking path, was the lifeless body of 31-year-old Vernon Huggins. His head had been shattered, so violently in fact that fragments of his skull were scattered in the grass. It wasn't just a killing, it was a brutal execution. Police quickly sealed off the area. They had no witnesses, no clear motive, and no suspects. The only thing they knew for sure was that someone had beaten Vernon Huggins to death with unimaginable force. Detective Gary Burks, a veteran of the Toledo Police Department, was assigned to the investigation. He canvassed the area, searched for evidence, and interviewed anyone who might have seen something. But weeks turned into months, and leads grew cold. There was no weapon, no eyewitness, and no clear reason why Huggins had been targeted. By November, just 3 months after the discovery, the case was labeled inactive. To the outside world, it seemed the murder of Vernon Huggins might never be solved. Then, in December 1992, everything changed. A call came into the Toledo Crime Stoppers hotline, and that call pointed detectives toward a group of local teenagers known as the Bishops, a small gang with a reputation for violence. The tip led police to a woman named Lisa Earle. She said members of the Bishops often hung out at her house on Yates Street. Among them were names that would soon become central to this story: John Urbina, the gang's founder Michelle Parkhurst, Joey Hall, and a quiet, 16-year-old boy named Eric Mish. This was the first time Mish's name appeared anywhere near the investigation, and it would mark the beginning of a nightmare he could never have imagined. Police began interviewing people close to the gang. Urbina told detectives that one night during the summer, some of his friends came back to his house bragging that they'd beaten up a black man and stolen his wallet. The details were hazy. Urbina first claimed it happened in July, but when detectives corrected him and said the murder took place in August, he changed his story to match. Another witness, Michelle Parkhurst, said she remembered gang members arriving at her house late one night, around midnight or 1 a.m., covered in paint or blood, and bragging about an attack. She didn't mention Mish. Then there was Joey Hall, who gave conflicting stories but suggested he might have witnessed the murder. With no physical evidence and only unreliable witness statements, police were desperate to build a case. And soon, they would focus their attention on the youngest and most vulnerable person in the group, Eric Mish. On February 2nd, 1993, detectives brought Mish in for questioning. He was just 16, a teenager, scared and confused, and his mother had given police permission to speak with him. At first, Mish denied everything. He said he had nothing to do with the murder and didn't know anything about it. But as the interrogation dragged on, detectives turned up the pressure. They told him he could spend the rest of his life in prison if he didn't cooperate. Terrified, Mish's resolve began to crack. Police took him to the crime scene, asking him to show them how the murder happened. He couldn't, so they started feeding him details, giving him pre-thoughts about how it might have happened. And eventually, after hours of pressure and fear, Mish gave them what they wanted, a confession. A confession that would change his life forever. In his statement, Mish claimed he and several others, Joseph Ricard, Louis Costilla, and the Vasquez brothers, had attacked Huggins in the park. With that confession, police believed they had cracked the case. But there was one problem. As soon as Mish was released, he recanted everything. He told police the confession was false, a story he made up because he was terrified of spending his life behind bars. It didn't matter. Just 3 days later, he was arrested for aggravated murder and robbery. 4 others were arrested too. The case, once cold, was now on fire, and in the eyes of police and prosecutors, they had their killers. But in truth, they had something far darker, a false confession from a frightened boy. Woodrow Wilson Park was no longer just a neighborhood playground. It was a crime scene, and a haunting one. 31-year-old Vernon Huggins' brutal death had shaken Toledo to its core. And yet weeks passed. Leads dried up, and the detectives assigned to the case, men like Gary Burks, had little more than a blood-soaked patch of grass and a shattered skull to go on. After 3 months, the murder of Vernon Huggins was quietly shelved as inactive. A brutal killing with no suspects. But this story, and its tangled path to injustice, was only beginning. The tip came through Toledo's Crime Stoppers hotline. A woman claimed to know something about the men responsible. Her name, Lisa Earle. She told detectives that a local street gang known as the Bishops often gathered at her house on Yates Street. It was a promising lead, maybe even the first real one since Huggins' body was found. The case was reopened, and 2 new detectives, Robert Leiter and James Anderson, were assigned. They started knocking on doors. Lisa's information led them deeper into the gang's orbit. To John Urbina, the self-proclaimed founder of the Bishops, Michelle Parkhurst, a young woman who'd been living at Lisa's house that summer, and Joey Hall, another teen with loose gang ties. At first glance, it looked like the police might finally be closing in. But as we'll see, this investigation would unravel into something far darker. John Urbina's story was explosive. He claimed that one summer night, some of his gang members showed up bragging about beating up a black man and stealing his wallet. He said the story came between midnight and 2 a.m., roughly when Vernon Huggins had been killed. But there was a problem. Urbina originally told police it had happened in July, weeks before the murder. Only after detectives corrected him did he adjust his timeline to match August 4th. Next, detectives interviewed Michelle Parkhurst. Her story was similar. A group of Bishops came home one night covered in paint or blood, boasting about attacking a black man. But Michelle didn't name names. Not a single one. And then there was Joey Hall. His statements were inconsistent, shifting versions of events, details that changed every time. But he did say one thing the detectives wanted to hear. He claimed he had witnessed the attack. From a shaky chain of hearsay and contradictions, police were starting to build a theory. And they were about to put a name to it. On February 2nd, 1993, detectives brought in a 16-year-old boy named Eric Misch. Misch wasn't just any teen. He was a fringe member of the Bishops, and according to Urbina, he had been bragging about the beating. With his mother's permission, detectives escorted Misch to the station. At first, Misch was clear. He knew nothing about the murder and had nothing to do with it. But the tone of the interrogation soon shifted. Detectives would later admit they told him he could spend the rest of his life, until he was 50 years old, behind bars unless he told them what happened. Imagine that, a terrified 16-year-old, facing decades in prison, sitting alone in a room with seasoned homicide detectives. Misch later said it was at that moment he broke. Not because he was guilty, but because he was scared. They said if I didn't say I was there, they was gonna lock me up until I was 50. I was getting scared. I didn't want to go to jail for something I know I didn't do. The detectives took him to the park, asking him to show how the murder happened. But he couldn't. He didn't know. Instead, police helped him remember, giving him pre-thoughts, guiding his story, and correcting him when he got details wrong. Back at the station, after hours of pressure, Misch gave a recorded confession, implicating himself and 4 others. 24-year-old Joseph Ricard, 20-year-old Luis Costilla Jr., 16-year-old Ismael Vasquez, 17-year-old Lorenzo Vasquez. It was the story police had been looking for, but it was a story that would crumble almost immediately. The very next day, Eric Misch recanted everything. He told police his statement was false and refused to testify before a grand jury. But it didn't matter. On February 5th, he was arrested, along with Ricard, Costilla, and the Vasquez brothers. All were charged with aggravated murder and aggravated robbery. The prosecution painted a chilling narrative, a racially motivated gang attack fueled by hate, ending in a man's death. The story sounded airtight, but it was built on shaky foundations, coerced confessions, contradictory witness statements, and zero physical evidence linking Misch to the crime. Still, the case was moving forward, and soon, Toledo would witness a courtroom drama that would decide the fates of 5 young men. But behind the scenes, troubling questions lingered. Why had so many stories changed over time? Why did the evidence seem to fit the police narrative rather than the other way around? And most importantly, could a terrified teenager's confession really solve a brutal murder? The investigation was far from over, but already, the threads of truth and fiction were starting to blur. Before we reveal what happens next, take a moment to catch your breath. The most shocking twists are still to come. Stay with us. By the summer of 1993, the city of Toledo was hungry for justice. Vernon Huggins had been beaten to death almost a year earlier, and now 5 young men, Joseph Ricard, Luis Costilla Jr., Ismael Vasquez, Lorenzo Vasquez, and Eric Misch, stood accused of his murder. The prosecution's story was simple, brutal even. It claimed the men, members of a violent street gang known as the Bishops, targeted Huggins simply because he was black. But behind that neat narrative was a mess of contradictions, shaky testimonies, and a confession that might have been built on fear rather than truth. The courtroom would soon become a stage, and the stakes were life or death. The first to stand trial were Joseph Ricard and Luis Costilla. It was June 1993, and the Lucas County Court of Common Pleas was packed with journalists, police officers, and the victim's grieving family. The prosecution wasted no time painting a picture of racial hatred, gang members prowling the night, armed with homemade wooden clubs, eager to spill blood. The state called its star witnesses, the same people whose stories had first led detectives to the suspects. Joey Hall, 17, took the stand. He claimed he was about 30 feet away when Ricard, Costilla, and the Vasquez brothers attacked Vernon Huggins. But Hall admitted he hadn't taken part himself. His testimony was shaky, full of gaps and inconsistencies, but it placed the defendants at the scene. Next came Michelle Parkhurst. She told the jury that Ricard and Costilla burst into a house party in the early hours of August 4th, covered in spots of red. Ricard insisted it was paint. Parkhurst didn't believe it. She said Costilla's clothes were a mess, stained and splattered. And then came the words that echoed through the courtroom. He bragged that they had fed up an asterisk. The jury gasped. The statement, if true, was damning. But what Parkhurst didn't tell them was that her story had changed dramatically from her first police interview. Back then, she hadn't even been sure who was involved. Now, nearly a year later, her memory seemed crystal clear. The prosecution's final blow came from Dr. Diane Scala Barnett, a deputy coroner. She described the horror of Vernon Huggins' injuries: a skull shattered into fragments like a cracked eggshell, the brain beneath torn apart by blunt force trauma. A forensic anthropologist, Julie Mathersall, testified that the force was so violent she couldn't reconstruct the skull. A baseball bat, she said, could have caused the damage, or perhaps something smaller like a club. The jury deliberated for days. And on June 17, 1993, they delivered their verdict, guilty of murder. Ricard and Costilla were sentenced to 15 years to life. The charge of aggravated robbery? Not proven. The prosecution was just getting started. And next on their list was the youngest, and most controversial, of all, Eric Misch. December 1993. Eric Misch, just 16 years old at the time of the murder, walked into court facing life behind bars. Once again, the prosecution told the same story: a racially motivated gang assault, a savage beating, and a bragging group of teenagers who thought they'd gotten away with murder. But this time, the evidence was even weaker. Joey Hall, the one witness who claimed to have seen the attack, didn't testify. Instead, the state leaned heavily on Michelle Parkhurst and John Urbina. Parkhurst's memory, however, seemed to have evolved yet again. She now claimed Misch was present on the night of the killing, though she admitted she wasn't sure if he actually got out of the car. At one point, she even said she didn't know his name until detectives told her. When pressed about the date of the attack, she confessed she only knew it because Detective Leiter told her. The defense objected when she mentioned a photographic lineup they hadn't known about, but the objection was denied. The identification stood. Then Urbina testified. He claimed that in the early morning hours after the murder, he'd spoken with Costilla, the Vasquez brothers, and Misch, and they bragged about beating up a black man. But under cross-examination, his credibility unraveled. Urbina admitted that in his first statement, he'd never even mentioned being out that night. In fact, he originally said he'd been home all day celebrating his mother's birthday. The inconsistencies were piling up. But the prosecution had one last card to play. The linchpin of the state's case was a single, shaky piece of evidence: Misch's confession. Detectives Leiter and Anderson took the stand, insisting that Misch had confessed voluntarily, no threats, no coercion. They played the recording for the jury. In it, Misch described how the gang had decided to rob Huggins. He said he approached and asked for the time, and when Huggins turned away, Costilla and Ricard attacked. The Vasquez brothers joined in. But under oath, Misch told a very different story. They said if I didn't say I was there, they was gonna lock me up until I was 50. I was scared. I didn't want to go to jail for something I know I didn't do. He said detectives had fed him details, telling him where the body was found, what the victim looked like, even correcting him when he got the location wrong. When asked if he knew anything about the murder beyond what police told him, Mish answered simply, "No, I do not." The defense called Mish's mother, his girlfriend, and a family friend to testify that he had black friends and biracial relatives, that he had no history of racial hatred. But their words were no match for the chilling confession the jury had just heard. On December 9, 1993, the jury delivered its verdict. Eric Mish was convicted of aggravated murder and aggravated robbery. His sentence, 20 years to life. One by one, the other defendants fell. In January 1994, the Vasquez brothers entered Alford pleas, maintaining their innocence while acknowledging the state had enough evidence to convict them. Each was sentenced to 15 years to life. By 1995, every appeal had failed. The conviction stood. For the people of Toledo, the case was closed. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But behind prison walls, Eric Mish insisted the truth had been buried. And in the years to come, the cracks in the case would only grow wider. On a cold December morning in 1993, Eric Mish was led through the steel gates of the Toledo Correctional Facility, wearing a state-issued jumpsuit and shackles that clinked with every step. He was just 17 years old. The rest of his life, or at least the next 20 years, would be spent behind bars for a crime he swore he didn't commit. For the justice system, the case was over. The press had moved on. The public had forgotten his name. But for Eric, this was just the beginning. There's a saying among inmates, the first night is the longest. For Eric Mish, that night felt endless. The metal bunk, the concrete walls, the relentless noise, it was all a shock to the system. Just a few months earlier, he was a teenager with plans to graduate, a kid who loved video games and hung out with friends after school. Now he was inmate number 46811, convicted of aggravated murder and robbery. He cried quietly that first night, not because he was weak, but because the reality was overwhelming. The justice system had branded him a killer, and in the eyes of fellow inmates, that made him either dangerous or a target. Prison life was brutal. Eric learned quickly that trust was a luxury. Every conversation, every favor, came with strings attached. Older inmates pressed him for details about the crime. Guards watched him with suspicion. He felt trapped, not just by the physical walls, but by a system that seemed determined to keep him there. Yet, in the darkest corners of his cell, a small spark remained. He still believed the truth would set him free. "I didn't kill anyone," he would repeat to himself. "One day someone will listen." Eric wasn't alone in his fight. Ismael and Lorenzo Vasquez, who had entered Alford pleas, were serving their own 15 to life sentences. Like Eric, they claimed innocence, but the plea deals had effectively silenced them. Speaking out now would risk longer sentences, so most of the time, they kept quiet. In rare moments, they spoke openly in the prison yard. They wanted someone to pay for that man's death. Didn't matter who. We were just the names that fit. For the Vasquez brothers, the plea was a compromise. For Eric, refusing one was a stand, and that stand was costing him everything. Prison changes people. For Eric, it forced him to grow up fast. He spent hours in the law library, reading about wrongful convictions and coerced confessions. He wrote letter after letter, to lawyers, journalists, innocence projects, anyone who would listen. Most of those letters went unanswered. Some came back with polite rejections. Others never returned at all. The appeals process was slow and unforgiving. Courts denied his motions, ruling that the evidence was sufficient and the confession voluntary. Each denial was a gut punch, another reminder that the system that convicted him wasn't built to admit mistakes. One of the cruelest truths about wrongful convictions isn't just the lost freedom, it's the lost life. The things that can't be returned, the relationships that fade, the person you might have become. Inside, Eric transformed. He was no longer the scared 17-year-old boy from Toledo. He became a student of the law, a jailhouse advocate for other inmates, and eventually, a mentor to younger prisoners. But even as he helped others, he couldn't escape the thought that haunted him every night. What if this is it? What if no one ever believes me? Then, nearly a decade into his sentence, something changed. A local investigative journalist named Carla Jennings stumbled upon his case while researching wrongful convictions in Ohio. The inconsistencies jumped out immediately: the contradictory witness statements, the lack of physical evidence, and most of all, the coerced confession of a scared teenager. Carla reached out. She visited Eric in prison, and for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Something about this case just didn't add up. The timeline was shaky. The witness testimonies were unreliable. And Eric's so-called confession, it read like a script someone else wrote. Carla's investigation reignited public interest. She published a series of articles questioning the conviction. Advocacy groups took notice. And slowly, the tide began to turn. By the early 2000s, Eric Mish's story was no longer just another forgotten case. It was a symbol, a cautionary tale of how quickly justice can go wrong. But hope is not the same as freedom. Appeals still had to be filed. New evidence still needed to be uncovered. And the legal system once again moved painfully slow. Yet, for the first time since that cold December morning, Eric had reason to believe his voice might finally be heard. Behind bars, he had found resilience. Beyond hope, he had found purpose. And in the chapters ahead, that purpose would become the driving force behind a fight that would span decades. A fight not just for his freedom, but for the truth itself. Before we step into the dramatic final chapters of this story, let's pause for a moment. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know. By the early 2000s, nearly a decade had passed since Eric Mish and the 4 other young men were convicted for the murder of Vernon Huggins. Most people in Toledo barely remembered the case anymore. Life had moved on. But inside Ohio's prison system, Eric's fight for freedom was only growing stronger. And outside those prison walls, people were finally starting to listen. The once airtight prosecution story, the one that sent 5 teenagers to prison for life, was beginning to show cracks. Big ones. It all started with a single phone call. Investigative journalist Carla Jennings, who had first written about Eric's case years earlier, had never stopped digging. She spent late nights combing through court transcripts, police reports, and interrogation tapes. She interviewed witnesses who had testified against the defendants. And what she found was deeply troubling. The more she dug, the more the story unraveled. Everywhere I looked, there were inconsistencies, details that didn't match, testimonies that changed over time, and a confession that didn't hold up under scrutiny. The closer I looked, the more I realized this case wasn't about justice. It was about convenience. Carla's articles reignited public interest in the case. Local newspapers ran headlines like, "Toledo teen's conviction under scrutiny. Was justice served? Confession or coercion? Questions haunt 1992 murder case." And soon, attorneys and innocence organizations began asking the same question Carla had. Had the wrong men been convicted? The first major crack appeared in 2004, when Joey Hall, one of the state's key witnesses, agreed to speak to Carla off the record. His story had been the cornerstone of the prosecution, placing the defendants at the scene of the crime. But now, over a decade later, Hall's memory was different. "I was 17. The cops scared the hell out of me. They said if I didn't talk, I could be charged too. I didn't see what they said I saw, not clearly anyway." His statement shook the case. If Hall hadn't actually seen the attack, the prosecution's timeline collapsed. Then came Michelle Parkhurst. Once the prosecution's most dramatic witness, she had testified that the men bragged about beating up a black man and came home covered in blood. But in a sworn affidavit years later, Parkhurst admitted she had been pressured by police and was unsure of key details. "They kept telling me names. They told me what to remember. At some point, I wasn't even sure what was real anymore." With 2 of the star witnesses now contradicting their original testimonies, the state's case was starting to crumble. Studio microphone narrator. But the most significant piece of evidence, the one that had sealed Eric Mish's fate, was his confession. And now, that too was under intense scrutiny. Carla brought in Dr. Alan Hughes, a nationally recognized expert on police interrogation and false confessions. After reviewing the audio and transcripts, Dr. Hughes was stunned. "This is a textbook example of a coerced confession. The suspect was a minor. The questioning was lengthy, manipulative, and suggestive. Investigators fed him details, and he repeated them back. That's not a genuine confession. That's contamination." Dr. Hughes pointed to numerous red flags. Eric had repeated exact details detectives mentioned to him. He got basic facts wrong, like where the body was found, until police corrected him. And he described events that were inconsistent with forensic evidence. Most importantly, there was no physical evidence tying Eric to the scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no blood, nothing. All the state had, the only thing, was a confession that now looked more like the product of fear than guilt. As Carla dug deeper, she discovered something even more disturbing. Eric's case wasn't unique. Throughout the 1990s, dozens of teenagers across Ohio and across America had been convicted based on coerced confessions and shaky eyewitness testimony. Many were later exonerated. Some spent decades behind bars before the truth came out. The system had a pattern. Police targeted vulnerable suspects. Witnesses were pressured to testify. Confessions were treated as unquestionable truth, even when the details didn't make sense. Eric Mish's case wasn't just a tragedy. It was a symptom of something much bigger, a justice system willing to sacrifice truth for closure. Armed with new witness statements, expert opinions, and investigative findings, Carla reached out to the Ohio Innocence Project. In 2006, they agreed to review Eric's case. Their legal team filed a motion for a new trial, citing recanted witness testimony, evidence of police misconduct, expert analysis suggesting a coerced confession. The state pushed back hard. Prosecutors argued the convictions were final. They claimed the recantations were unreliable and the confession was still valid. But for the first time in years, Eric's case was back in court. For over a decade, I've been screaming into the dark, hoping someone would hear me. Maybe now they finally will. But justice, even when it's clear, is never simple. The judge denied the motion for a new trial. He ruled that the new evidence did not fundamentally undermine the original verdict. It was a crushing blow, another door slammed shut. Still, the fight wasn't over. Carla's reporting had made national headlines. Advocacy groups were rallying behind Eric. Public opinion was shifting, and the cracks in the case were now too big to ignore. The story that once seemed so clear, a brutal gang attack, a righteous conviction, was now collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Witnesses had recanted, experts had spoken, and the confession that sent a teenager to prison looked more like a lie than the truth. But would it be enough to free Eric Mish? Or would the system continue to protect its own verdict, even in the face of overwhelming doubt? By 2015, more than 2 decades had passed since Eric Mish was convicted of a crime he swore he didn't commit. He had entered prison as a teenager, confused, scared, and heartbroken. Now he was a middle-aged man, hardened by the weight of injustice, but still holding on to one thing: hope. Hope that one day the truth would rise to the surface. Hope that someone would listen. Hope that this nightmare, the one that began on a cold night in 1992, would finally end. And that hope was about to pay off. The tide began to turn in 2017, when a new wave of attorneys at the Ohio Innocence Project reopened Eric's case with fresh eyes. Among them was Abigail Mason, a young but relentless attorney known for taking on the toughest wrongful conviction cases. When I read the transcripts, I was stunned. The inconsistencies, the unreliable witnesses, the confession that made no sense. This wasn't justice, it was a textbook miscarriage. Mason's team assembled a powerful case for exoneration, more thorough, more aggressive, and more compelling than any before. They didn't just poke holes in the original investigation, they dismantled it entirely. This time, they had the resources to dig deeper. They subpoenaed hidden police records. They obtained sealed witness interviews. And they uncovered something the original defense team had never been given: evidence pointing to another suspect. It was buried deep in a dusty police evidence locker, a report written just days after Vernon Huggins's murder. In it, detectives noted a different group of young men seen fleeing the scene that night. The lead was never followed. The report was never shared with the defense. This is a Brady violation, plain and simple. Exculpatory evidence was withheld. If the jury had seen this, there's a good chance Eric Mish would never have been convicted. But that wasn't all. The team also tracked down 2 new witnesses who had come forward over the years. Both said they saw people leaving the scene, and none of them matched the 5 young men who were convicted. The case against Eric was falling apart. In 2021, armed with overwhelming new evidence, Mason filed a motion with the Ohio Court of Appeals demanding a new trial. The brief was hundreds of pages long, meticulously detailing every flaw in the original investigation, every inconsistency in the witness statements, and every piece of suppressed evidence. For the first time in decades, the state was on the defensive. The state stands by the original conviction. The evidence presented at trial was sufficient, but the judges weren't so sure. During oral arguments, they grilled prosecutors on the suppressed police reports, the unreliable confession, and the witnesses who had since recanted. The once ironclad case against Eric now looked like it had been built on sand. On August 13, 2024, the courtroom was packed. Eric sat at the defense table, hands trembling, unable to look away from the bench as the presiding judge began to read the decision. The suppression of exculpatory evidence, combined with the unreliability of the confession and recantations of key witnesses, undermines confidence in the original verdict. The motion for a new trial is granted. The room erupted. Eric's mother wept quietly into her hands. Abigail Mason placed a reassuring hand on Eric's shoulder. After more than 32 years, the conviction that had defined his life was officially vacated. But their work wasn't over yet. The state had the option to retry the case. And they did. The retrial began in May 2025, and this time, it was nothing like the original. Gone were the dramatic eyewitness claims. Gone were the manipulative interrogation tapes. And gone was the air of certainty that had once hovered over the prosecution. Instead, the jury heard about coerced confessions, racial bias, police misconduct, and suppressed evidence. They heard from experts on false confessions, from new witnesses who contradicted the original story, and from forensic specialists who made one thing clear. There was zero physical evidence tying Eric to the crime. For 30 years, this man has been labeled a murderer. But the evidence never supported that label. Today, you have the chance to correct a terrible mistake. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. On July 25, 2025, Eric Misch stood before the judge one last time. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreperson rose to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. The room exploded with emotion. Eric's mother collapsed into tears. Abigail Mason hugged him tightly. And for the first time in more than 3 decades, Eric walked out of a courtroom a free man. He had entered prison a teenager and left a middle-aged man. He had lost his youth, his opportunities, his future, but he had never lost his hope. Eric's case is more than just a story of injustice corrected. It's a warning, a reminder of how easily the system can fail, and how hard it is to fix those failures once they happen. In the wake of his exoneration, Ohio lawmakers introduced new legislation requiring stricter standards for interrogations, mandatory recording of all interviews with minors, and improved disclosure of evidence. Eric now works with advocacy groups to push for national reforms. I can't get those years back, but if telling my story means someone else doesn't lose theirs, then maybe it all meant something. Eric Misch's story is not an isolated tragedy. It's part of a long and painful history of wrongful convictions, of young people railroaded by a system that values quick answers over real justice. But it's also a story of perseverance, of journalists who refused to stop digging, of lawyers who refused to give up, of a man who refused to let a lie define his life. And above all, it's a story of redemption, proof that even after decades in darkness, the truth can still find the light. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, made you think, or made you question, then don't let it end here. Backhand index pointing right, share this video to spread Eric's story. Backhand index pointing right, subscribe to Conviction Reversed so you don't miss the next case where justice was delayed but not denied. Backhand index pointing right, and most importantly, speak out, because the more we demand accountability, the fewer innocent people will ever have to endure what Eric did. Because justice delayed is not justice denied, but it's justice we must fight for.